There's something wrong with the deer in my town. Part 3 of 3. By Redditor Riot Hyena. Starting from when y'all last heard from me, I had a good rest and then woke up when Scott had been knocking on my door to check up on me. I was in kind of a state when I woke up, so Scott and I sat down and talked about what Mr. Miller told me. He brought Boots over, and I can't tell you how much that little cat helped calm me. There's something magical about a cat's purr. Anyway, I can't believe it didn't occur to me, but Scott's dad is still alive, obviously. It sounds like my dad told everyone in town to shut up, but if anyone is immune to being told what to do, it's Robert fucking Saltman. At Rob's place, it was before opening time, so Scott used his key on the shop door to let us in. We walked into the back workshop, where we knew Rob would be. He startled when he saw us, but then got that old bastard glow. You know, that happy to see you but too much of a bastard to smile kinda glow? That one. Scott got right to it though. Just out and asked him, "Dad, tell me about Mom." Rob got a solemn look, said something like, "By this point I was thinking you'd never up and ask me about it." He clapped his hands on his knees, got up, and took a picture off the wall of his workshop to show us. It was a younger Rob at one of the diners in town, with a beautiful girl beside him that had Scott's tawny hair. They looked so happy. He told us her name was Sophie. He'd met her in high school, and she was wonderful. She loved everything around her, and had this need to nurture, a lot like Scott does. She kept a lot of animals, and worked for a wild animal sanctuary. There was a way about her that made Rob want to protect her with everything he had, so they fell in together naturally. Rob said my dad was his best friend, and my mom, Lucille, was actually Sophie's best friend. My dad met my mom through Sophie, and they were an instant power couple. My dad knew he wanted to work in the ranger service since he was a kid, and my mom was a wildlife biologist or ecologist or, as Rob put it, some sciencey shit like that. They just clicked. My mom was the first one to get pregnant. I asked Rob how that could be, since Scott is a year older than me, and he said that's because she miscarried 6 months in. They were devastated, obviously. My parents tried again, and again. As if to add insult to injury, Sophie became pregnant shortly after my mom's third miscarriage. It drove a wedge between them, even though it's not like Sophie planned it that way. With her naturally motherly personality, it was hard for Sophie to stifle her excitement about having her own baby, and even though she tried to tone it down around Lucille, it grated on her nerves anyway. It was at this time that the other women came into town. They were travelers. Rob called them gypsies, but I think that's an outdated term. I don't think they were actually Romani either, just 2 traveling women selling spiritual-based cures, fucking hoodoo herb and water horseshit. As Rob put it. Immediately half the town didn't like them, because they were shady, spoke indirectly in riddles and phrases, and constantly restated that they're harmless. If someone's harmless, why would they feel the need to convince people of it? Repeatedly? But Sophie liked everything and everybody. She thought they meant well, and was more than happy to give them a chance. When they said they had a remedy for my mom's pregnancy issues, well, Sophie thought if it worked, they would be friends again, and my mom would be happy again, and they could be mothers together. If it didn't work, at least they tried. My mom had been beside herself with grief, so when Sophie, her best friend in the whole world, glowing with pregnancy, came to her offering a solution, she trusted her immediately. The traveling women told my mom all this spiritual mumbo-jumbo bullcrap, as Rob delicately phrased it. I guess they must have used enough truthful-sounding and harmless information blended together with cult-wise spiritual garbage that took advantage of my mom's weakened state that they had her hook, line, and sinker. She became obsessed with the cure these women offered her. My dad was alarmed, because my mom usually had such a logical and scientific mind. And all of a sudden she was hanging antlers bound with herbs from the ceiling of the nursery and begging the spirits of the forest to bless her womb with life. She was making routine trips with these traveling women into a certain part of the forest, and while my dad tried to follow them a few times, they'd always manage to slip him and disappear. When he'd ask Sophie about it, she became cagey and nervous, and would find some reason to leave the room, or something would come up. It worked. Lucille did become pregnant. Rob says he thinks it was at that point that Sophie became ensnared, too. Helping my mom keep her pregnancy became Sophie's mission. Anything those traveling women told her to do, she'd do without question. You stopped seeing one of them without the other. If my mom so much as sneezed, Sophie would materialize with a tissue and a prayer to the forest. Sophie gave birth to Scott in the autumn, and in winter 1 year later, my mom gave birth to me. I was healthy, too. My dad was relieved, of course, because I was born healthy, but also because he thought that was the end of my mom's delusional spiritual phase. Rob told us about memories he has of him and my dad hanging out together in the yard, throwing tennis balls for the dogs, drinking celebratory whiskey and cracking jokes about the traveling women. He said it was like all this weight lifted off my dad and he was himself again, for just a little bit. But my mom just got deeper into it. The traveling women set up a camp in the woods, and my mom spent way too much time there. My dad started getting irate because he could barely see his new son. And Sophie never used to be bothered by Rob's love of hunting, but now she openly condemned it. Rob told us he was heartbroken. Because their idyllic life was being torn apart by these hippy-dippy deer-hugging gypsy bitches. He didn't see Scott much either because Sophie went wherever my mom went. So my dad and Rob talked, and then talked more, and then they got drunk. They met up with some other men from the town who were also irate about the presence of these traveling women, and the effect they were having on other women in town. They all got more drunk, together, and then as is typical of small-town minds, they decided they should do something about it, and being drunk, that something was something stupid. I'm not saying what they did was the best option, or could even be called an option. But I can't say I blame them for being upset. I think they really love their wives and they saw those traveler women as the root of the problem, so they wanted to fix it. In a way, they were just trying to be good men and good husbands and banish the evil that was hurting the loves of their lives, and now, their children, too. Even the Millers were involved then. Obviously, Mr. Miller was older than my dad at the time. But he was the fire chief and his wife had been convinced by these women that their daughter was cursed by wolf spirits. It got really out of hand, and then it got worse. Rob was quiet when he told us this, and I could see the shame coloring his cheeks. He said him and my dad had spoken to my mom and Sophie, and made them promise they'd stay out of the woods that night. Said the rangers got a report of a bear close to the trails, so they got some men together and were gonna chase it deeper into the woods. A lot of the men told their partners similar stories. It was a cougar. A pack of wolves. A sick moose. They'd gotten loaded up and brought a jerrycan into the woods with them. They'd found the camp that night by putting their heads together. Rob said it took them hours because it damn near blended into the woods. It was an old wooden wagon, meant to be drawn by horses, covered in leaves and so weathered it looked like tree bark. There weren't any horses, but they saw elk tethered to a tree nearby, which Rob said pissed them off more for some reason. They got behind the wagon, dumped some gasoline over one of the wheels, and they set it on fire. As soon as they lit the torch, and the fire started spreading, the elk snapped free of their tethers. One of them set onto my dad, and the other bellowed into the night like a call of alarm. All the women, the travelers, my mom and Sophie, Miriam, and a couple other women, came running out of the carriage. The traveling women were screaming indignities already, but when Rob shot the elk that was attacking my dad, they started wailing. Rob said he doesn't remember much of the rest of that night, but he remembers my dad's chest covered in blood from the elk's antlers. Though he didn't know whose blood stained him more of the elk's or my dad's. He remembered the other men feeding the fire so it engulfed the entire carriage. He then remembered running from the fire, all but those two traveling women. When they got back into town, although it was deep into the night, people were in the streets watching the glow of the fire in the mountainside, spreading to the trees around that campsite. In the subsequent days, there was town meetings both official and unofficial. Most of the men involved were men of authority in some way: the sheriff, the fire chief, one of the elected aldermen for the town board. My dad, one of the longest-running and most trusted members of the Forest Service. It's probably why they felt the responsibility to do something about it. It was a scandal to some people and a great movement of justice to others. Everyone distrusted the women, so nobody made any great complaint about what happened anyway, even if some disagreed with how it was handled. Rob sighed and stared at the floor. "This is the part everything gets fucked up." Scott scoffed and said, "What? Witch doctors and arson isn't fucked up?" Rob gave him a sobering look and said nothing in response. He took a beat of silence to gather himself and sat back down. "It was a few months after we burned the carriage. What we'd found your mother's doing. Why they both got ran out of town, none too gentle." He described the way my nursery was set up. The crib close to one corner. After the fire, my mom had removed a lot of her spiritual talismans from the room, but kept an antler mobile she'd made above my crib. There was a large empty space in the center of the room that used to have a rug, but she threw that out shortly after the fire. My crib was hollow, with a large storage drawer under the bed. There were wooden slats under the mattress of my crib, and those slats, and the mattress, were the only things separating me from the contents of that drawer. Rob told me the way he'd heard it from my dad. I started crying in the middle of the night, and he'd gotten up to attend to me. When he'd opened the door to my nursery, he saw the figure of my mom hunched over my crib, and heard a loud rattling noise. He didn't want to wake me fully, so he didn't turn all the lights on. He'd asked her what was wrong, but she didn't answer him. Still half asleep, he asked why she'd gotten such a loud new toy for me. No answer. He said he thought it was scaring me, and it's late, but she still didn't answer. He felt dread sink deeper into his heart the more his brain processed the sound and the thick smell in the room. Pennies. Soil. He flicked the light on to see my mom, covered in blood. The upper half of a doe was sprawled across the floor, disemboweled, with entrails strung around the posts of my crib like celebratory bunting. The lower half of that deer was across the room, hanging by its leg over buckets full of its draining blood. My mom was waving antlers, still steaming with fresh entrails, over me. And in the drawer lied so many antlers they looked like tangled brambles, with a western rattlesnake, curled and angry, tucked beneath them, quivering its cacophonous tail in warning. Rob said he remembered hearing my dad just about break his door down in the middle of the night. He'd answered it, still half asleep, bombarded by my dad's hysteria. I was wailing in his arms, still sticky and stinking of fresh doe blood, and that set off Rob's dogs barking. Then Scott started wailing from upstairs. He said, "The goddamn fire brigade would have been quieter than your dad and you that night," and unsurprisingly, the sudden eruption of noise woke up just about the whole goddamn neighborhood. My dad just kept yelling about the nursery, the fucking nursery, wild-eyed and frantic, and it took Rob a moment to realize my dad had been asking Rob where Scott's nursery was. He sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time to the nursery, my dad hot on his heels, and sure enough, Sophie was in Scott's nursery, holding a hunting knife. Standing over a barely bleeding and badly injured deer. She hadn't killed it yet. Rob said he's sure she just didn't have it in her to finish it off. It just wasn't her. She'd been asking him to take her hunting, teach her, which she'd never done before, and he thought they'd been going back to normal, or that she'd been trying to make it up to him. They'd gone out that morning and he showed her his favorite clearing to watch for them. Just about killed me, seeing her betray us like that. Betray us. I found it very interesting the way he'd phrased it. Betrayal. As far as everyone knows, our moms never intended to hurt us that night. They were just performing some fucked up ritual for God knows what fucking purpose. Sophie had captured a rattlesnake too, and had it stored in a box beside Scott's bed. Whether they'd intended to hurt us or not, the town was outraged. I guess putting babies at risk of rattlesnake bites was the last straw, because even the naysayers from the fire a few months ago were incensed when they saw my dad holding me, wailing and covered in blood. My mom and Sophie both were chased out of town that night. They got in a car together and left without a word after they were confronted by their shouting neighbors. Rob said he doesn't remember a lot of how that happened. It was just a lot of yelling and wrath, punctuated by the sharp penny smell of all that blood on me and my mom. I think I'll post tomorrow about what happened next. This was a lot to write out and pretty emotional to hear about. Hard to recap, too. I hope you'll forgive me for that. I'd made plans to meet up with Scott for breakfast at the hospital anyway, and I have to head out by 6 if I'm going to be there when the cafeteria opens at 7. I'll be sure to post the update soon.